read the Sunday paper? Oh, honey.
Yes, Fred?
You see the Sunday paper?
No, Fred, it hasn't come yet. Oh, Mr. Flintstone, here's your paper. Check. Did you get your paper, dear?
Yeah, and I'm lucky. It only comes...
Okay, it's time for a video. Hey Isopod fans, it's Wally. I get so many questions about the Supreme Isopod Chow, and I never ever do these promotional type of videos, but it's about time. Now we're going to do something very different. Here you see Nanette and Crystal are feeding some isopods, and while they feed, I'm going to go ahead and answer some of these questions that we've received the last month on the Supreme Isopod Chow. Let's take the very first one here. Where should I feed the Supreme Isopod Chow? The damp side or the dry side? We always feed it on the dry side. Why is that? Because if you put it on the damp side, it has a tendency to mold up. Any food that you feed on the damp side will mold. We're going to talk about the molding factor here in just a second, but let's take a look at this second question. Is the Supreme Isopod Chow an all-in-one food? No, it's not. Make sure you're feeding leaves and decaying wood, as well as any supplemental food such as the Supreme Isopod Chow. And we have 3 different varieties of the Supreme Isopod Chow. The normal, the protein times 10, and the veggie plus plus. The protein times 10 is for animals such as dairy cows, who really require a lot of protein in their diet. The veggie plus plus are for isopods such as Armadillidium. How often should I feed the Supreme Isopod Chow to my isopods? Well, we feed once a week. If you go a little bit shorter than that, if you go a little bit longer than that, that's okay. And you have to kind of measure and get a feel for how much your isopods are going to eat of the Isopod Chow, and then adjust accordingly for that weekly feeding. We actually schedule on a weekly schedule simply because it's a better timing for our moisture and adding water to those enclosures. Here's another question. Should I give my isopods any other food than Supreme Isopod Chow? You can see Nanette and Crystal right now giving us a myriad of different foods other than Supreme Isopod Chow. We give fish flake food, freeze-dried minnows, mealworms, which we're using right now because we get a lot of mealworms in and some of them die. We throw them into the refrigerator and pull them out when we're ready to feed the isopods. We also feed freeze-dried shrimp and mushrooms. Our schedule is kind of unique. We'll feed the Supreme Isopod Chow the first week. The next week we'll feed another supplemental food. The week after the third week, then we go right back to Supreme Isopod Chow. So we're feeding the Supreme Isopod Chow every other week. Here's a special note though. While the Supreme Isopod Chow is a very, very important food in their diet because it has so many great ingredients, the primary food that you should be feeding your isopods is the substrate and the leaves and dried flaky wood. Those are so important to their diets. Here's the question we get all the time. Can I mix the Supreme Isopod Chow with water? You don't have to do that. I know there's other foods on the market for isopods that do require mixing with water. If you mix water with the Supreme Isopod Chow, it's going to be okay, but you really don't need to do that. Make sure that you're putting in moisture into your enclosures, of course. That's a main part of keeping isopods, but you do not have to mix water with the Supreme Isopod Chow. What happens if the Supreme Isopod Chow does mold up? Well, the simple answer there is you can pick up the chow because it will harden because it's too moist, and you can just throw it away. Again, 90% of the problem with this is that either somebody has put it on the damp side or they're misting their whole enclosure and getting the Supreme Isopod Chow wet. You can get it a little wet, but don't overload moisture onto the Supreme Isopod Chow. How large of a bag should I be purchasing? We get this question quite a bit to try to measure about how much food to feed your isopods. And again, as I said earlier, it's going to take a little bit of time to get a feel for how much your isopods are eating in one feeding. It's really hard for me to say feed 1 tablespoon to your culture because I don't know the size of your isopods, how many you have, or how often you're feeding. I've always suggested to people to feed a little bit more than they feel like they need to in the beginning, and then cut back as you need to. And how large of a bag should I purchase? Well, once you get a feel for how much Supreme Isopod Chow you're feeding, always purchase a bag of about 6 months or so of feedings. Here's a great question. Should I store the Supreme Isopod Chow in the fridge? Well, you don't need to, but you can. If you do store it in the refrigerator, the vitamins will have a longer lifespan. This question relates to the question about how much food should be purchased at one time. And that is, does the Supreme Isopod Chow go bad? I've never had it go bad in our facility. If it starts going bad, you'll see it starting to get a little bit hard. If it starts to get a little bit hard, you can simply break it apart and then store it in the refrigerator. Here's a question I've had 2 or 3 times. What's the recipe of the Supreme Isopod Chow? Well, the simple answer is that the recipe is right there on the back of the bags. All the ingredients are included in that list. And you can see at the top of that list is leaves and dead wood. I sometimes think, though, that some people are asking what the recipe is so that they could start making their own. And that's fine. You can certainly play around with the recipe. We've tested the exact amount of ingredients for the Supreme Isopod Chow for 6 months before giving it to other friends to test for another 2 or 3 months before introducing it to the market. Somebody on social media recently asked, what foods, prepared foods, can I feed my isopods? And we had one person, a big-time breeder, come back and say that all the prepared foods are crap. Now, I don't feel that way at all. I certainly believe that the leaves and rotting wood is the main ingredients in a healthy isopod's diet. But the better prepared isopod foods have a lot of other ingredients that the isopods are going to find in nature. Again, you can check the ingredients on the back of the Supreme Isopod Chow bags and find out exactly what we're feeding to make our isopods as healthy and as good of breeders as we possibly can. And finally, we get this question a lot. How do I order Supreme Isopod Chow? You can certainly go to our store, Supreme Gecko. The link is in the description, and purchase your Supreme Isopod Chow. Now, there are varieties of the Supreme Isopod Chow. As I mentioned before, there's vegetable and protein, as well as shaker bottles and all the other foods such as shrimp and mealworms that I mentioned before. I normally don't do promotional videos like this on items that we sell on the Supreme Gecko store. This is an exception because we're getting so many questions. If you want to see more isopod content, make sure you click the link in the upper right-hand corner of this video to see tons and tons of other isopod videos. Thank you everyone for joining today. Good luck with your isopods. See you next video.